Open the podcast bay doors, Hal.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 149 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits, but I found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider to be the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. I have a few recurring features on the show, and one that I haven't come back to in a little while is Jesse C's question about the lesser-known members of the X-Men. If you don't read the comics and only know the team from the movies and cartoons, there's a number of characters you've never been introduced to, or only saw briefly and may want to know more about. And so I've been going through in chronological order of those X-Men and X-Women joining the team, discussing their powers and histories. Well, we've reached a vital turning point in X-Men history. In the late 1960s, the title was not selling well, and in 1970 it was decided that it would be cheaper to simply reprint older stories rather than write and draw new ones. So for 5 years, from issue 67 to issue 93, that's what was done. But in 1975, writer Len Wein and artist Dave Cockrum created a new team of X-Men, partially from characters already introduced and partially from characters Cockrum had drawn up originally as potential members of the Legion of Superheroes when he was working on that DC title. Most of these characters are ones that everyone has heard of if they have at least a passing knowledge of the X-Men. Nightcrawler, Colossus, Storm, Wolverine. Cyclops also stays on the team, being one of the only originals to stick around. If it weren't for this reinvention of the team, the X-Men might just be a footnote in Marvel's history. Instead, they became one of Marvel's consistently best-selling books for much of the next 50 years. Now, I briefly mentioned the well-known members of this new team, but there are 3 others who joined in this issue that are not nearly as universally recognized, and that's who we'll set our focus on now. Unlike most comic book titles published in the US at the time, the focus of this new X-Men team was international. Nightcrawler from Germany, Colossus is Russian, Storm originates from Africa, Wolverine is proudly Canadian, and our next lesser-known member continues that trend with Sean Cassidy, aka Banshee, coming from the Emerald Isle known as Ireland. First introduced back in X-Men number 28, written by Roy Thomas with art by Werner Roth, Sean is a former lawman, having been both an NYPD police officer and an agent for Interpol. While on a long undercover assignment for the international organization, Sean's wife Maeve was one of many victims of a terrorist bomb in Northern Ireland. Unbeknownst to Sean, his wife had gotten pregnant just before he left, and gave birth to a daughter right before her untimely death. Sean's cousin Tom, best known as X-Men villain Black Tom Cassidy, took in the girl and raised her as his own without telling Sean. She eventually returns as the X-Force character Siren. But back to Sean himself. After his wife's death, Sean turns away from the law and became a criminal instead. He was eventually forcefully recruited by a group called Factor 3, which is when he got his codename of Banshee, due to his ability to emit a sonic scream that could not only be used destructively, but could also generate shields, hypnotize people, and even allowed him to fly. When Banshee and fellow Factor 3 agent Ogre were confronted by the X-Men, Professor X was able to free Banshee from the group's control. A little while later, the Professor recruited Sean to join his new team of X-Men, whose first mission was to rescue the original team that had been captured by the living island of Krakoa. Banshee stayed with the X-Men for some time, falling in love with their ally Moira McTaggart and eventually discovering the existence of his daughter and reuniting with her. Banshee later became the co-headmaster of the second team of younger X-Men trainees known as Generation X. The first team was the New Mutants, most of which later graduated to X-Force. He briefly ran a team known as X-Corps, but unfortunately for him, X-Men villain Mystique had infiltrated the team and slit Banshee's throat when he was unaware. Although she intended on him bleeding to death, he was rescued by his former students. He survived, but was rendered nearly powerless by the damage done. He died shortly thereafter in the Deadly Genesis miniseries that introduced Vulcan and the retconned actual second team of X-Men. Check out the previous episode in this feature for more on them. Of course, Sean did come back, albeit as a corpse-like figure called the Horseman of Death. He was finally resurrected to his original form when the X-Men moved onto Krakoa. Yes, the same living island that Banshee was recruited to save the first team from. Sean was recently betrayed by his on-again, off-again love, Moira McTaggart, and afterwards was offered a bond with the Spirit of Variance, similar to the Spirit of Vengeance that controls the Ghost Rider, but one dedicated to change instead of revenge, and is now known as Vox Ignis, voice of fire in case you don't speak Latin. Of course, comics being what they are, I'm sure the spirit will eventually move on and Banshee will return, but for now we'll just have to wait and see. Or perhaps wait and listen is more appropriate. The second in our trio of lesser-known X-Men from this era is another international member that had already made appearances in the book, but had not yet been recruited as of Giant Size X-Men number 1. Shiro Yoshida was first seen in X-Men number 64, written by Roy Thomas with art by Don Heck, just 3 issues before the move to reprints as mentioned earlier. Shiro's mother was one of the survivors of the atomic bombing at Hiroshima near the end of World War II, and she was pregnant with him at the time. She died in childbirth, and it's suggested that this prenatal radiation exposure is what mutated Shiro to grant him the powers he gained when he grew older. This was later retconned to his grandfather being in Nagasaki due to Marvel's sliding timeline. While Shiro's father worked for peace, Shiro listened more to his bitter uncle, who hated Americans for what they had done to their country. In his first appearance, Shiro, now taking on the name Sunfire, appropriate given the intense heated plasma he could create, attacked a dedication ceremony at the United Nations that his father was speaking at, but was stopped by some of the X-Men who had detected the young mutant's arrival in town. Sunfire escaped and returned to attack the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. The young mutant clashed again with the X-Men, but beat them fairly easily and was about to destroy the Congressional House when his father showed up on the dome, forcing his son to choose between his hatred of America and love of his father. However, Shiro's uncle was also there and shot Shiro's father. Sunfire killed his uncle with one burst of his powers and went to his father's side, who, with his dying words, begged his son to give up the cause of war and work for peace. Shiro was seen in a couple of non-X titles as an anti-heroic figure before Professor X went to Japan and recruited Sunfire for his new team to rescue the X-Men. Sunfire agreed to help originally, but as soon as that first mission was over, he returned to his homeland, saying that if the X-Men needed help, not to bother calling him. Sunfire became one of Japan's premier superheroes, but again, since basically all of Marvel's titles at the time focused on America, he was rarely seen. In the 1990s, he had his status quo shaken up by an electromagnetic pulse that Magneto released on the world, which affected Shiro's mutant abilities somehow, causing him to unwittingly release a blast of power on Tokyo. While no one was actually hurt by the event, the Japanese government imprisoned Shiro out of fear. Over the next few years, he was freed and captured by various factions a number of times, and subjected to experiments and accidents that caused him to nearly die at least twice. After one near-death encounter, he fully recovered and decided to finally join the X-Men, decades after his original rejection of the team. Unfortunately, his tenure ended with his apparent death, when Lady Deathstrike struck from behind, taking his legs clean off, then had his powers completely absorbed by Rogue when she accidentally went too far. He had requested the absorption, but it was meant to be temporary. His body was lost in the ensuing fight, and of course, that does mean he came back again, this time as one of Apocalypse's horsemen, Famine, similar to Banshee's tenure as the Horseman of Death. After freeing himself from Apocalypse's influence, Sunfire joined the Avengers Unity Squad, a team specifically made to combine non-mutants and mutants onto a single team after the events of Avengers vs. X-Men. He was one of the inverted heroes during the Axis storyline. Long story short, due to Red Skull having Professor X's powers, some heroes became villains and vice versa, and was part of a team of X-Men trying to kill every non-mutant on Earth. He and most of the other characters inverted in this storyline returned to their normal morality at the end. When the mutants banded together on the island of Krakoa, Sunfire joined them, and was elected to join the X-Men team at the end of the first Hellfire Gala on the island. He has since stepped down and focused his attention on Arakko, which in the Marvel Universe is the planet formerly known as Mars, that was terraformed and colonized by the mutant nation. The X-Men books are really out there right now, as I've alluded to in past episodes. There's one last X-Men member from the Giant Size issue that we need to discuss, and he's the only one, besides the well-known members, who had not been seen previous to that storyline, and he was the only new member to originate in the United States. In fact, he was a Native American, specifically born on an Apache reservation, named John Proudstar. John was a former U.S. Marine when he was recruited for the team, but despite his success during his tour of duty, he was unsatisfied with his life, trying to find a way to prove himself to be a true warrior, like his ancestors. The X-Men seemed like it might be a good outlet for that quest, but John, now going by the codename Thunderbird, didn't like taking orders from team leader Cyclops, and so instantly clashed with him and most of his other teammates. Thunderbird's tenure as an X-Men was cut short when he was killed in an explosion in literally the very next story, a two-parter in X-Men number 94 and 95. The team was fighting Count Nefaria, who had taken over the NORAD command center in Colorado. The X-Men defeated the Count, and Nefaria attempted to escape in a jet. Against the orders of his team, Thunderbird climbed on as the plane took off and ripped it open and tore it apart until it exploded, killing the young mutant instantly. Nefaria, of course, teleported away at the last second. Thunderbird's death was one of the very few comic book deaths that stuck. While he was briefly resurrected during storylines where multiple characters crossed back over, specifically Necrosha and Chaos War, he was laid back to rest at the end of both of those tales. There have been two other men to take on the Thunderbird codename, his brother James Proudstar and Neil Shara, but John himself mostly stayed a cautionary tale for the X-Men. However, he finally returned to life thanks to the resurrection protocols of Krakoa Island. James is not a full-time resident of Krakoa, however, feeling uncomfortable around all the younger mutants who see him as a martyr. So he's moved back to the Apache reservation where he lives with his grandmother Lozan. But he planted a Krakoa gateway seed outside her house so that he can travel back to the mutant nation whenever he's needed. A little behind-the-scenes tidbit. In the 70s, it was determined that Thunderbird and Wolverine were too close to one another in character, both being loudmouth contrarians who hated authority. And so the creators decided to kill one of them off. Obviously, they chose Thunderbird, but imagine the world where Wolverine was killed off instead and only now was reappearing. One last thing before we wrap up. At the time, including members from other countries as part of the X-Men team was a step towards progressiveness and inclusivity. Unfortunately, there's little to no sign that Len Wein or follow-up writer Chris Claremont did much, if any, research to depict more than the most stereotypical traits of each of these characters' cultural backgrounds. However, that is changing today, as writers and artists who actually share the heritage of some of these characters get to depict their adventures. I especially recommend the Marvel Voices one-shots, as well as the other history of the DC Universe, for more representative stories of various cultures and minorities. So, that's another installment in the Why Men, as I've been titling this feature. When I return to it, we'll hit the 1980s, including the disco diva herself, Dazzler. In the meantime, as I've mentioned previously, I'm always looking for your suggestions as to what you'd like to hear covered in future episodes, whether it be about comics, board games, role-playing, or any other geeky topic. You can send any and all of those via email to welcome2geektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Or you can go to the website, welcome to, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com, and click the Submit a Question link if you prefer to remain anonymous. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcome to Geektown, Twitter @GeektownPodcast, or Mastodon @welcome2geektown @mastodon.social. Also, if you'd like to support the show directly, why not become a patron at patreon.com/welcome to Geektown for just $1 per month to get access to full scripts of the shows, audio outtakes, and a monthly shoutout. You can also help the show grow by subscribing and giving a 5-star review over on Apple Podcasts to join the Geektown City Council, which helps other people find the show so we can all tell them, welcome to Geektown, population, us. Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material, their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.